He laughs first, almost always. Before anyone else in the room can react, he has already turned the moment into a joke. I notice this happens at funerals, at hospital bedsides, in the middle of arguments that should have broken something open. You have seen it too, in a father, a brother, a husband who deflects with a punchline exactly when silence would have told the truth. The timing is too precise to be accidental, too consistent to be mere coincidence. It arrives at the exact second feeling threatens to surface, and it lands before anyone, including him, can name what almost happened. There is no pause before the joke, no visible deliberation, only the immediate reflex. What is the joke actually protecting? And from whom is it protecting it? Look closer at the pattern, because patterns of this kind are never random. The humor clusters around specific triggers: vulnerability, failure, tenderness, loss. A diagnosis becomes a one-liner before the room has even processed the word itself. A layoff becomes self-deprecating material at dinner, delivered with practiced ease. A son's wedding becomes an excuse for old jokes instead of new words, as though sincerity were a language he never quite learned to speak in front of an audience. The comedy is selective, and selection reveals intention, even when the man himself denies any intention at all. He would say he is simply lightening the mood, nothing more calculated than that. But the mood only needed lightening because something heavier had already started to rise beneath it. The joke is not random noise scattered across a life. It is a targeted response to a specific internal signal, fired the instant that signal appears, faster than conscious thought could ever manage. What sustains this pattern across so many decades, unbroken? A habit this consistent is not improvised in the moment, manufactured fresh each time it is needed. It was built carefully, repeated relentlessly, reinforced until it became reflexive, automatic, indistinguishable from instinct. Somewhere in his early life, humor worked, and it worked well enough to be trusted again and again. It de-escalated a volatile parent before things could turn dangerous. It deflected a teacher's anger in a classroom where anger had real consequences. It bought social safety in a peer group where any visible softness was punished swiftly, publicly, and without mercy. The boy who could make the room laugh was the boy who controlled the room, if only for a few seconds, and those few seconds were enough to avoid being seen as weak in front of people who would remember the weakness forever. The lesson embedded itself before he had language to question it, before he could even recognize that a lesson was being taught at all. Humor became a tool of survival before it ever became a personality trait worth naming. You can hear the difference if you listen closely enough for it. Jokes that simply entertain, and jokes that disarm a threat only he can sense, even now, decades later, in rooms that pose no real danger at all. Trace the mechanism further still, because the mechanism itself is more elegant than it first appears. Humor functions as a release valve precisely because it allows emotional content to be expressed without ever being acknowledged as emotional content. He can say something devastating and call it a bit, and the room will laugh instead of asking him if he is all right. He can confess a genuine fear and frame it as absurd, and the fear gets received as entertainment rather than disclosure. The words themselves carry real information, sometimes the truest information he will offer all year, but the delivery cancels their weight, like a check written and voided in the same motion, leaving no trace of the transaction behind. This arrangement is remarkably efficient.
It lets pressure escape without requiring him to sit inside the pressure for even a moment, and without requiring anyone around him to respond with the gravity the moment actually demands. Efficiency, however, always carries a cost somewhere downstream. Each time the valve releases pressure this way, the underlying feeling is never actually processed, only vented into the air and dispersed. The feeling does not disappear simply because it was never named. It returns, almost without exception. It always returns, because nothing about the original feeling was resolved, only redirected into a shape the room could safely applaud. Now ask what generation, what specific cultural moment shaped this particular tool into something so widely shared. He grew up in homes that were often unsupervised by design, not neglect exactly, but absence normalized as a virtue called independence. Parents worked longer hours, often both of them, often alone, often exhausted by the time anyone got home. Television raised him in the after-school hours as much as any adult did, and the comedy of that era taught a very specific, very durable lesson. Pain delivered with a punchline is acceptable, even admirable, while pain delivered straight is a burden no one signed up to carry. Sitcoms turned divorce into a one-liner week after week until the formula felt natural rather than constructed. Stand-up comedians turned childhood trauma into an applause break, proving night after night that suffering could be converted into something valuable if it was packaged correctly. The cultural air he breathed rewarded wit and quietly punished sincerity, and a child absorbing that lesson daily for years on end does not choose it consciously or deliberately. He simply learns, the way any organism learns, what gets a warm response and what gets cold silence, and he optimizes accordingly, shaping himself around the environment he actually inhabited rather than the one he might have preferred. The accumulation is what makes this so difficult to undo, even decades later, even with effort. One joke on its own is nothing at all, barely worth noticing. 1,000 jokes deployed consistently at every single site of emotional exposure across 40 years becomes a wall so familiar it no longer reads as a wall to anyone, including the man standing behind it. It simply reads as him, as his personality, as the texture of who he has always been. Colleagues call him the funny one without a second thought. Family calls him the one who keeps things light, the one you can count on at a tense holiday table. These labels feel like compliments, and in a narrow, immediate sense, they genuinely are, but they also function as quiet confirmation that the strategy is working, that it is wanted, that deviating from it now would disappoint people who have come to depend on his deflection nearly as much as he depends on it himself. The wall gets reinforced from both directions at once, from inside, where it continues to protect him from exposure, and from outside, where it continues to be rewarded with affection and approval. This is the point where habit quietly becomes identity, or the line between the two simply dissolves. He no longer experiences humor as something he does in response to discomfort, as a strategy chosen among other available strategies. He experiences it as who he fundamentally is, as basic and unchangeable as his name. Ask him directly whether he is hiding something behind the jokes, and the question itself will most likely become material for another joke before he is even finished hearing it, because there is no longer a clear boundary between the defense and the self being defended by that defense. The two have fused completely, seamlessly, somewhere along the way without either of them noticing the moment it happened. To stop joking now would not feel like revealing a hidden feeling that had simply been tucked away. It would feel like losing a fundamental piece of his own character, a kind of erasure he has no internal framework for tolerating or even understanding. You may have felt this firsthand in someone close to you, the unmistakable sense that asking them to be serious for 5 uninterrupted minutes is somehow asking them to become an entirely different person. Once identity has been built this way, responsibility enters the picture differently than most people would expect. He is not just funny in some passive, incidental sense. He has become the one responsible for the room's emotional temperature at every gathering he attends. He monitors tension the way a thermostat continuously monitors heat, scanning constantly without conscious effort, and the moment discomfort rises past a certain familiar threshold, the joke fires automatically, a regulatory mechanism fully disguised as spontaneous, effortless wit.
This is genuine labor, even though no one names it that way, including him, who experiences it as simply being himself, rather than as work being performed on behalf of others. He has assigned himself the unspoken job of preventing other people's discomfort at almost any cost, which means his own discomfort gets permanently deprioritized, pushed to the back of a queue that never actually gets serviced, because servicing it now would require breaking the very mechanism that everyone around him, himself included, has come to quietly rely on. Relationships organize themselves around this structure, whether anyone in them consciously intends that outcome or not. People learn, without ever being told explicitly, that this is simply not someone you bring real grief to, not someone you hand your rawest moments. You bring him the funny version of your problems instead, and he will match your tone instinctively, because that particular tone is the only register in which he can fully, comfortably participate. The relationship becomes shallower in one specific narrow zone, though nowhere else, not in loyalty, which often remains genuinely strong, not in presence, which can be remarkably consistent, but in the particular kind of intimacy that requires two people sitting together inside something painful without either one trying to fix the air around them. That specific kind of closeness becomes rare first, then absent entirely, then, eventually, unrecognized as something that was ever even missing in the first place, because no one inside the relationship retains a memory of it functioning any other way. Consider what this gradually does to a marriage, a friendship, a relationship with an adult child, given enough accumulated years. The other person may eventually stop bringing him their actual pain at all, not out of growing distance exactly, but out of a learned, almost protective accuracy about how he will respond. They sense correctly through long and repeated experience that doing so will be met with deflection rather than presence, and so they quietly redirect that pain elsewhere instead, to a friend, a therapist, a private journal, anywhere it might actually be received with the weight it deserves. He may never notice this redirection happening at all, because the conversations he is still having with this person continue to feel entirely normal to him, even pleasant, even close in whatever ways closeness remains visible to him. What he cannot see, what he has no access to, is the parallel relationship his loved ones are now having with their own pain, conducted entirely outside the room he still occupies, believing himself fully present. This raises the question of meaning, though not in any abstract or philosophical sense, nothing requiring elaborate theory. What does a man like this still genuinely consider worth keeping after decades spent perfecting a system that keeps everyone, including himself, at a carefully managed emotional distance from one another? Often the answer narrows down to function and function alone, being useful in the room, being reliably present, being the one who can always be counted on to lighten a heavy table or a tense car ride. These are not small things, and they should not be dismissed as small things. They carry real, measurable value, and the people around him often genuinely benefit from his timing, his levity, his consistent refusal to let a bad moment curdle into a worse one. But function is not the same thing as connection, and a life organized almost entirely around function can feel, from the inside, where he actually lives, oddly hollow even when it looks, from the outside, where everyone else is watching, entirely full and complete. Here, the investigation reaches its deepest layer, the one that explains why this pattern feels so universal rather than personal. None of this was invented by one man alone, in isolation, through some private process of his own design. It was inherited, absorbed, reinforced by an entire generation raised under remarkably similar conditions: increased independence forced on children at a young age, a media culture that systematically monetized deflection, and a model of masculinity that treated visible emotional need as a liability rather than as a simple, unremarkable fact of being human. Millions of boys learned essentially the same lesson at roughly the same time, in roughly the same cultural climate, breathing the same television and the same silences, and grew into millions of men who now use humor for the same unspoken purpose, often without ever comparing notes with one another, often without recognizing that the man standing next to him, telling his own joke at his own funeral-adjacent moment, learned the exact same strategy from the exact same kind of silence, in a different house in a different town, with no awareness that the two of them had arrived at an identical solution. This is the part that remains invisible even to those living inside it every single day. He does not think of himself as guarded or defended in any particular way. He thinks of himself simply as easygoing, as someone for whom things just naturally roll off. His friends do not think of him as a man actively avoiding something difficult. They think of him as someone who reliably makes things bearable, who can always be trusted to lighten what needs lightening. The system works precisely because it does not announce itself as a system at any point along the way. It simply looks like personality, like culture, like the ordinary, unremarkable texture of a generation that learned to survive by making things funny before anyone had the chance to ask whether they were actually okay underneath it all.
No one designed this collectively or deliberately through any kind of coordinated decision, and yet nearly everyone arrived at the same design independently, as if pulled there by forces considerably larger than any single individual choice could ever account for on its own. There's a particular moment worth dwelling on here because it reveals something about how thoroughly this defense has been installed. Watch what happens when a stranger, someone with no history with him, attempts genuine sincerity in his direction. A doctor delivers difficult news. A colleague offers an unprompted compliment about his character rather than his performance. A grandchild says something unguarded and true. In each case, something in him visibly recoils before it recovers, a flicker that lasts less than a second, followed almost immediately by the joke that smooths the moment back into familiar territory. This recoil is data. It suggests the defense is not selective with audience, that it does not relax simply because the threat is low or the stakes are small. It fires regardless of who is in the room, because the trigger was never really about the room. The trigger has always been internal, calibrated decades ago, indifferent to whether the present moment actually warrants the same level of protection. Consider, too, what happens on the rare occasions the defense fails to activate in time. Something slips through, a sentence delivered without its usual comedic armor, and the room goes quiet in a way that visibly unsettles him more than it unsettles anyone else present. He will often retroactively correct the moment, adding a joke a beat too late, as if trying to undo an accidental exposure. Watch his eyes in that gap between the sincere sentence and the joke that follows it. There is something close to panic there, brief and well concealed, the look of a man who has just realized the valve opened without his permission. This is not weakness, it is simply evidence of how much architecture has been built around keeping that valve closed, and how disorienting it becomes when the architecture briefly fails. Seen this way, in full, the whole structure becomes a single unified mechanism rather than a loose series of unrelated personal traits scattered across a life. The childhood environment produced the original tool, shaped under specific and identifiable pressures. The tool, repeated thousands of times across thousands of moments, became habit, automatic and unexamined. The habit, sustained without interruption across decades, became identity itself, indistinguishable from personality. The identity, once fully formed, redefined responsibility around the ongoing management of other people's comfort rather than his own. That responsibility reshaped every close relationship around a quiet, missing register of shared pain that was never allowed to surface in his presence. The absence of that register quietly came to define what a life organized this way ultimately means, and the whole pattern, multiplied across an entire generation living in parallel, became something that almost no one inside it can fully see, because truly seeing it would require exactly the kind of sustained, unguarded attention that the pattern itself was originally built to avoid at all costs. The investigation does not end here with any tidy conclusion, any resolution offered for its own sake. He's not asked to stop joking, and nothing here suggests that he should. You are not asked to agree with anything written in this observation. What remains when the structure has finally been laid out in full is only this: a mechanism made visible that was, until now, simply called a sense of humor. Nothing more complicated than that. Whether seeing it clearly changes anything at all is not really the point of this exercise. The point was only ever to see it, once, fully, without flinching, and without a convenient punchline arriving at the last second to interrupt the seeing before it could finish. There is another pattern adjacent to this one, equally familiar to anyone watching closely, equally unexamined by most who live inside it, waiting in the same psychological terrain this man has occupied for decades without ever fully mapping its boundaries. Thank you for following this all the way through. If parts of this matched someone you know or matched yourself, say so in the comments below. And if this kind of quiet, careful observation is something you want more of, consider subscribing so the next investigation finds you when it is ready.